Hello and welcome to Patriot Paths. My name is Lake Green and today I am excited to be back with yet another lecture video in the 1776 lecture series. Today's topic of discussion will be on the American evacuation of Fort Lee on November 20th, 1776, and the beginning of the long, dark, harrowing retreat through New Jersey towards Pennsylvania and the Delaware River in that winter. This was a very dark time for not only the American Army, but for the entire cause of America and an independent country in general. It was devastating after the losses at Fort Washington and White Plains and Brooklyn and Kips Bay, and just in general, the Army was beleaguered, tired, starving, and in a horrible state. But before we get into any details, I want to remind you always that I can only talk so much in 10 minutes about the 1776 campaign. So if you want more information and you want to learn a lot of details about this period in American history that I can't tell you in 10 minutes, please get 1776 by David McCullough. It's a phenomenal work. It's palatable, easy to read, accessible, and really will serve as a great resource to you if you're really looking to get into the campaign. So please check it out. So on November 16th, the American Army was decimated after losing the Battle of Fort Washington. Over 3,000 men were killed, wounded, or captured by the British and Hessians in Manhattan, and the last stronghold of American resistance on Manhattan Island, and really in New York State at the time, was crushed. It was a horrible decision by General Nathaniel Greene and Robert McGaw, the commander of the fort, to decide to hold out against the British. Washington really felt like it should have been abandoned, but Greene himself, against his better judgment, really, I guess, decided to hold it, and he made a horrible blunder that would cost the American Army dearly, not just for the 3,000 men and 30 cannons that they lost, but also for the scores and scores of provisions that were stored in Fort Washington. And they would lose even more at Fort Lee just a couple days later. But right now, let's talk about Fort Washington. Inside Fort Washington, you had scores and scores of food supplies, flour, wheat, grain, to feed the army. You had tents and blankets and campwear and clothing. There was so much resources within those walls that the American Army was desperate for. Remember, the British Army has full uniforms. They're a professional fighting force. Most of the Americans that are fighting in the Continental Army at this time are wearing the clothes that they brought from their homes. They're not uniformed. Very few men in the Army had an actual uniform. Very few men were even issued weapons by their states. They were carrying their own weapons. They were making their own ammunition. They're completely, unorganized in terms of logistics. And the Army will be plagued by this for years to come, but right now, things just began to get very dire here in 1776. After the fall of Fort Washington, the American Army only had some 12 to 15,000 men remaining in their ranks. And to make matters worse, as I talked about last video, Washington actually, on his retreat south towards Manhattan from White Plains, left a lot of men in upstate New York defending strategic points that the Army wanted to hold on to, outposts, supply depots, because he was worried that if the British should defeat him in Manhattan and chase him southward, which would happen, that they might move up through New York and cut off the New England colonies from the rest of the country. And at the time, the heart of the rebellion is New England. We're not in the South yet. We're not in the Mid-Atlantic. It's been untouched by war. So it's a crucial strategic move by Washington to keep men in upstate New York. But when he does this, he weakens his already depleted force. He leaves 5,500 men in North Castle, New York, under his second-in-command, General Charles Lee. North Castle is right near White Plains. He leaves them stationed there as he marches south. And he leaves over 3,200 men even further north in Peekskill under General William Heath. Those are mostly New Englanders, militia units, and regular soldiers that are stationed throughout upstate New York. They will remain there. They won't be moving anytime soon. And so now that's almost some 9,000 men in total that Washington is now left in upstate New York, and he now has under his personal command, including the men that are at Fort Lee, not counting those that he just lost at Fort Washington, the men that he still has number in the 5,000s. So under his direct and personal command, he has about 5,000 men. And of these 5,000, 3,200 of them are in Fort Lee in northern New Jersey across the Hudson River, and they're really garrisoned under Nathaniel Greene. So directly under him, he has only 2,400 to 2,200 men. But in total, he has about 5,000. Washington, after trying to, digest the defeat, the devastating action that happened at Fort Washington, he sits for a couple days and then writes to Congress and says, I am determined not to give another inch of ground. We're going to hold Fort Lee, and we're not going to let the British go into New Jersey. Within 24 hours of him writing this, he realizes that's a completely foolhardy thing to say and a horrible military maneuver to remain in Fort Lee. Not only because Fort Lee, as a garrison itself, has almost no strategic importance remaining anymore to the war effort, because they've lost Fort Washington and they can't guard the British ships from sailing up the Hudson River, but also because they don't have the force to hold on against the British. If they were to advance across the Hudson River and march into New Jersey with 10, 15, 20,000 men, whatever the British have, Washington has a meager force of 5,500 men in the general vicinity to withstand them. A quarter of the British Army, less than that, 20% of the British Army, that's all it needs to do. That's all it needs to do to be deployed in New Jersey to meet Washington's numbers, equal his troop strength. They'll wipe him out in a matter of a short contest. So Washington decides with Nathaniel Greene on the night of November 19th and the early morning of November 20th to evacuate Fort Lee. He does this, though, being a day late and $1 short, because on the night of November 19th, around the same time Americans begin to think about withdrawing, the British Army, under General Charles Cornwallis, after being ordered by the Supreme Commander William Howe, marches across and sails across the Hudson River, marches to around Fort Washington and sails across the Hudson River, across to Fort Lee in the early morning hours of November 20th, with 4,000 men comprised of British and Hessian grenadiers, elite troops, as well as light infantry and Hessian Jagers, which are riflemen. And this 4,000 contingent of British and Hessian troops are driven by, I said, Charles Cornwallis. Cornwallis himself is a very different general than William Howe. Howe is cautious, he takes his time, he's slow to the draw. Cornwallis himself drives his men hard. He's seen how Washington has fought and how he's been, shifty and able to escape multiple times throughout the campaign up to this point. And he says, I'm not letting this happen on my watch. In the early morning hours of November 20th, he sails 4,000 men across the Hudson River to the banks of New Jersey and Fort Lee. And actually, Fort Lee is on a high palisade, like I said, in the New Jersey Highlands. And he and his men daringly, in the dead of night, scale up the palisades from the river. They climb the freaking mountain to get to the top and get into the fort, scaling the heights. If it wasn't for an American officer that hastily saw them sailing and marching up, raced back to the fort, the American army would have been captured in total. Nathaniel Greene and all the troops of 3,200 men inside the fort were sleeping. The officer bangs on Nathaniel Greene's door, rouses him from bed, tells him, the British are here in force. You better get up and get going. The Americans have such a frantic retreat from Fort Lee. They barely escape encirclement and capture, thousands more of them at Fort Lee on November 20th, that Washington runs up, organizes 300 men in a rear guard to try to defend the fort and hold off the British for such a slim amount of time that the other thousands can run. And that's literally what happens. It's basically a run. It's a rout. The Americans pretty much pick up whatever they have on their backs and leave. And of the 300 men that are in charge of the rear guard, only about 200 of them make it out, because another 100 and 5 are captured, and some 10 are killed in a brief skirmish. And the British march into Fort Lee in the early morning hours of November 20th, finding the American campfire still burning, the American men's breakfast still boiling in their kettles and their pots and their skillets on top of the freaking thing of their own position, and their own tents all set up. So the Americans abandoned not only all their tents, hundreds of pounds of flour and food, but also clothing and blankets. And the American men were already short on blankets. It's a devastating defeat. The 3,000 plus men get out by the skin of their teeth, and now joined with Washington's main force of the other 2,200. Now, about 5,000 weary and beleaguered men marched down Fort Lee Road southward into New Jersey, and at the time that was the only main road leading south into the state. Cornwallis and his men, realizing how close they were to capturing pretty much the last sizable remnants of the American army in New Jersey that are not in northern New York, pursued them in haste. And that will lead us into the next video, in which we discuss the harrowing retreat that these men execute through New Jersey. Thanks so much for watching. Rate, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you next time on Patriot Paths. I'm Lake Green.